Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a good day and everything's going well. Appreciate you being here this evening. Just again, ask you to continue to pray for our nation and the greatest nation on earth that can't seem to count. Ask you to remember them and our nation and pray for peace and harmony as much as humanly possible. Also ask you to continue to remember, again, I'm going to use first names, Geraldine, and also ask you to remember Kathy's mother. You've heard several times over the last little while as Gary's gave different testimony, but she's not doing well at all, and so continue to remember her, and so I'm sure there are others. Don Davis, I mentioned him a few weeks ago. Don is back in the hospital. I said I wasn't going to use last names, but I just did. Remember Don? Don's back in the hospital with COVID-related pneumonia, and so continue to remember him. And again, I'm sure I'm missing some, but continue to pray for them and and for everyone around you, safety of your church family, your family, friends as well. All right, if you will tonight, grab a Bible and turn with me to the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 1. We're going to look there, and I want to talk to you tonight about crisis and how crisis affects us, and how we as believers react when we have a crisis in our life. And all of us do have crisis at times. And again, our passage this evening is going to be Philippians chapter 1. We're going to be picking up in verse 12 and discussing again crisis. And again, one of the interesting things about crisis that I've noticed is that they come in all shapes and sizes, and your crisis may not be my crisis. There may be something that had the exact same thing could happen to both of us, and one of us be devastated and the other one not. And so crisis is very individual, and how it affects us is very individual. Read about a sculptor, and I really don't know who she is because I'm not a big art buff, but her name was Eva Hesse, and she died of a brain tumor when she was 34 years old. And one of the art critics wrote about her that she had, it would be safe to say, she had been shaped by crisis. And what he was basing that on was she was born in Germany to Jewish parents in the middle 1930s. She was separated from her parents as a child, and later in life, her mother committed suicide, and then she has the brain tumor, and so her life was crisis, an ongoing crisis, it seems like, and crisis has a way of shaping us all. Again, the critic who said we could say of her life it had been shaped by crisis. I think to some extent we all could say that the crisis of life, throughout our life, the various crises, they have a way of shaping us. I've heard stories of those who lived through America's Great Depression and how they were affected by that. One of the stories I've heard and seen even in going into folks' homes is those who were affected by the Depression. Many times they say one of the things, just it's kind of comical in one way, but not in another. One of the things that was in short supply during the Depression was toilet paper. And that I've read several different things and seen it myself that people talk about their grandparents. That somewhere in the house would just have a closet full of toilet paper. They weren't going to be caught in that regard, in that way again. And so that's one way, just an example. I mean, but it shapes our personality. It shapes how we interact with people. What we're going through right now in our nation is going to shape people. I think especially our children and young people are going to be shaped by what they see and what they're going through right now. And again, that's just a couple ways, but death, financial problems, divorce is one that certainly affects everybody involved, and again, in particularly, generally the children. But wherever it comes from, again, I said earlier that crisis is different for each of us. Wherever it comes from, it has a very, again, shaping effect on our life. And there's three things really that crisis shape, three areas that we need to be aware of, and that is the external effects of crisis, and the internal, and then the eternal. The external is actually what happens to us. It is, I guess, the crisis itself. The internal is what happens in us, what causes what what the crisis does to our personality, to our emotional standing, where we are in that regard. And then the eternal is that what happen that happens through us, that the crisis affects us, and then how we go out and deal with it. Our confidence in God, our testimony that comes out of that crisis that God can use to impact others, and that's the passage that brings me to our passage tonight. That again in Philippians, the whole book of Philippians was written while Paul was in prison in Rome. And he had been imprisoned not because of any real crime, but he had been thrown in prison for preaching the gospel. And when the church at Philippi found out that Paul was in prison, they were naturally concerned about Paul's well-being, how it would affect him. What would it? Obviously, it was going to stop his missionary work, but how would it affect him again internally? What would being imprisoned do to him? Would it, crush his spirit? Would it stop him from preaching in the future? There were a lot of questions about what this would do to them. And when Paul found out that the Philippians were so concerned about him, that's what he wrote the letter of Philippians back to them for, to encourage them and to let them know not only what had happened externally, what had happened to him, but internally, what was happening in him. But more importantly, Paul wanted him to know that eternally, some great things were happening in his life. And if you look in verse 12, Paul addresses it here. He says, you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out unto the furtherance of the gospel. And so Paul says, it is, I know you're concerned about me, but I want you to know that it is working out for the furtherance of the gospel. And the word furtherance, that's a word we don't use today, but it comes from a Greek word that was used to describe a group of the work of a group of woodcutters. And what would happen was in those days, an army obviously moved on foot. They marched everywhere they went. And when they came to a forest, they either had to go around it or work their way through it or cut their way through it somehow, which was delayed them and took time and took energy, and so they had a group of men who would go in front of the army and cut down the trees and cut a path so that the army could go continue to go through and make a new path for them, basically make a new road. And so Paul uses that same word to say that's what's happening to me is cutting down trees and making a new road for the gospel, making it easier for the gospel to go forward. And so he's saying, I'm getting to go places now that I've been arrested that I'd never get to go otherwise. He's been in and out of the palace, the seat of authority for the empire. And the second thing, Paul was being chained 24 hours a day to a Roman guard, and they changed that guard every 4 hours, and so every day Paul had 6 different guards that he had an opportunity to talk to and to witness to, and kind of extra biblical material indicates to us that the reason the gospel spread through Europe, there's really no other way to explain the spread of the gospel through Europe other than to say that those guards who had been chained to Paul took that gospel, that they got saved, and then they carried that gospel back home with them and shared it with their family and friends, and the gospel began to spread. Again, there's really not much other way to explain how the gospel got into some of the areas that it did. And so Paul was saying that it was to the furtherance of the gospel, that it was that it was opening up opportunity and doors for him to spread the gospels. He wrote, for example, the letter we're looking at, the letter Philippians. Paul dictated that letter. He had someone to write it down for him. And so here's the guard chained on this arm. Here's, the person writing down what, and so as he's talking and Paul's, dictating the letter he's writing, the guards, they're hearing every word. And so again, as this, the Roman soldiers were hearing the gospel and they were becoming saved. And then as they got assigned to go to a different area, they would talk to their other soldiers, they would talk to other people. And so, again, there's really not much other way to describe the spread of the gospel through Rome other than to say that it all began through Paul speaking to or in front of the guards that were chained to him on a daily basis. And so again, overall, the other thing that had come out of it is Paul was not the only Christian being persecuted. And when the church saw Paul's courage and saw him continuing to serve, it gave them strength and encouraged them to carry the gospel and to accomplish his God's will. And so, again, the persecution, the crisis that Paul was going through was the external. What was happening to him was internal, but then we know that it had an eternal difference as God brought the good out of a bad situation. And again, God, the same God that gave Paul that confidence and gave Paul that kind of impact can do the same thing through our crisis and through the times that we suffer and the problems that we go through. And what Paul says here in these verses, Paul says, Again, in verse 13, my bonds in Christ are manifest in the palace and other places. Many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak. And so Paul is, he says this, and this is, this is not the way I planned for it to happen, but God is working everything out. And what I want us to look at tonight as we kind of look at these three elements is, yes, crisis is real. You may be going through one right now. And so we're going to talk about those three things: the external, that it happens to us; the internal, what happens in us; and the eternal, what happens through us. Let's talk about, to begin with, then, the external. We've talked about Paul's situation. We know what Paul was going through, and we know that crisis affects everybody, no matter how rich, how poor. You can be a celebrity. The first one that pops into my mind fairly recently was Kobe Bryant, the basketball player's death. And so, you can be a heathen, you can be a dedicated Christian. And crisis still has a way of finding us, and and coming into our life. Somebody has said to expect bad things not to happen to you because you're a Christian, because you're good, is like expecting a mad bull not to charge at you because you're a vegetarian. And so, it's just not very, very logical thinking. Crisis happens to all people in all situations. And, there was an actress, and I can't remember her name right now, whose daughter died. And after the death of her daughter, she said herself, and I thought it was bold and brave of her to say, but she said that when crisis comes, when God allows the celebrities, the celebrated of this world, to have trouble and have crisis. It's kind of like his way of saying that nobody is privileged. Nobody's above, everybody's equal. And so, the truth is, and one of the things I think we have to be careful of as Christians is that we don't, and I know we do it, but I think we need to be careful about it, is that sometimes we kind of promote Christianity as a cure-all, as a barrier to bad things happen. Oh, if you'll just get in church, if you'll just get saved, everything will be okay. And the truth is, that's not true. It's not true in our life. And it's just not very realistic. Look at Job. Job lost everything he'd ever had. By God himself said that Job was one of the finest men that ever lived. And yet he still went through difficult times. Jesus himself is an example. Isaiah said about him, said he is despised of man, a man of sorrows. And so even Jesus was rejected. Every one of us gets our share of crisis. And so we just have to be honest about the external and know that there are things that happen to us. And generally speaking, we have no control over them. Sometimes we make the crisis, but ordinarily we have no control over what's happening to us. The difference in the external and the internal is what happens in us. And while we don't typically control what happens to us, we do have control over what happens in us. Look again at those words that Paul wrote. Paul says, these things have happened, have fallen me out rather into the furtherance of the gospel. Paul, he goes on, if you look in verse 15, he says, there's some preaching for the wrong reason, Paul says, I don't care as long as they're preaching. And so, there's, again, Paul, he was controlling, again, what happened. He was in control of what happened in him, and so are you. You may not can control the crisis, but you can control how you react to that crisis. The Swiss psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, he himself was placed in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he talked about how the people in those concentration camps all responded differently. He wrote, some of them, turned basically into animals, going around lying and stealing and attacking their fellow prisoners. But then he said there was some in the concentration camps who went around and helped others, prayed with others, gave away their food, tended to others' illnesses and hurts, and so everybody, they were in the exact same crisis, but they responded to it differently, and that's the mark I think that we need to look for as believers, not what happens to us, but what happens in us. And, again, that we choose the path we're going to take. Another story, I heard of a little boy who was going door to door selling pots and pans, he was a little crippled boy, and trying to make some extra money. And he went and wondered when the lady told him that she wasn't interested, and so the little boy turned around and started to walk off. And when he did, she noticed his limp, and she stopped him and said, "Oh, I didn't know you were crippled. Come back and I'll buy something. I'll buy something from you. I didn't know you were crippled." And the little boy came back and informed her. He said, "I'm selling pots and pans. Not trying to gain sympathy." And the story goes that the woman said, being crippled must color your life. And the little boy responded and said, "Yes, it does, but I choose what color." And that's the way with crisis in our life. We choose how it's going to affect. Somebody said that pain is inevitable, misery is optional. And I like that saying. We don't have to be that way. Again, some choose to go into the pit, into denial, into discouragement, depression, and others choose to rise above it and to live differently. Paul Powell is head of the Guidestone, the Baptist, the retirement agency, the people who handle retirement for pastors. And he talks about playing golf one time with a man who he had, as they played golf, he was telling Dr. Powell about how him and his wife had worked and planned and scheduled everything so they could both retire at 55 and enjoy their life. But unfortunately, the wife at 54 developed cancer, and by 55 she was dead. Shortly thereafter, the man's father died and passed away. And and so the man was, really bitter. And as they talked, Dr. Powell found out that this man had at one time been very involved in his church and all, but he wasn't going now. And so he invited him to his church. And the man looked at him and said, "No," says, "me and God are not on speaking terms right now." Which again, I think he went on basically told him, my wife, I prayed for my wife and he didn't hear me. I prayed for my father, he didn't hear me. And crisis has a way of doing that to our life. Again, what it does in us to make us angry. And this is a topic that just has so many great stories and illustrations to go along with showing both sides of how crisis affects us. Ray Charles, many of you will remember Ray Charles, blind singer, and I don't know if you know the whole story, but he was blind about the time he he was blind by the time he was 7 years old. Again, it would have been easy to be discouraged and depressed, to give up. But the story goes that his mama would tell him when if he'd kind of mope or whatever a little bit or try to get, she'd say, "You're blind, not stupid." And she made him work. She made him do things, and told him, "You lost your eyes, not your mind." And she would give him chores to do, and taught him to sweep and to mop and chop wood even, and do all those things. And Ray Charles said that his mama had made him understand and taught him as a young boy that if he thought about something long enough, he could figure out a way to do it. And said his mama would tell him, someday I'm not going to be here to to help you, and you're going to have to do it yourself. Now, look at those two stories. Ray Charles didn't have any more control over his blindness than the golfer did over the death of his wife. What they did have a choice over or between was how they would respond to that crisis, and how it would how it would affect them, how they would respond. Robert Louis Stevenson was basically bedridden, and somebody asked him how he kept such a good attitude, and he told them, he said, look at the sun shining, look at the sun shining in, and he says, I will never allow a row of medicine bottles to block my horizon. And so we choose what has happened to us. And one final story on this topic. There's a poem that was written that it's called A Straight Course, and it says, one ship goes east, another goes west, with the same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sails and not the gales which tells us the way to go. Like the winds of the sea are the ways of fate. So again, the same wind drives some to the east, some to the west. Crisis, we choose our response to how we're going to react to crisis, which leads us then to the final, most important piece, and that is the eternal. We talked about the external and the internal. Let's talk real quickly about the eternal. A crisis, as Paul says here, doesn't have to be the end. It could be the beginning. Naomi Judd, the country singer, when she found out that her health was going to cause her to have to quit touring and singing, her quote was, "This is not my tombstone, this is a stepping stone." And that's how Paul was in prison. It's how he saw it, as a stepping stone, not a tombstone. And he used his time in prison to witness to people that probably wouldn't have listened to him any other way. Paul probably could have never witnessed to these soldiers on the street. He probably never could have told this story in any other way. But these men, these guards, were chained to him, and they had no option but to listen to him. And most of his letters in the New Testament that we have were written while he was in prison. Martin Luther was in prison when he translated the New Testament into the German language. John Bunyan was in prison when he wrote Pilgrim's Promise. John the Apostle was exiled to the Isle of Patmos when he had the vision that led to the writing of the book of Revelation. And so all of these are just examples of guys that took what could have been a tombstone and turned it into a stepping stone. They didn't allow what was happening to them to destroy that which was in them, and so therefore they made a difference. They didn't allow the external to destroy the internal, and therefore they made an eternal difference. And that's what what we have to search for and what we have to strive after is what God can do through our crisis. Greatest crisis in the history of man is the story of Easter and the crucifixion of Christ. And he took that story and he turned that dark crucifixion day into that wonderful resurrection day. And so it's good enough for we see how God can use those crises to accomplish great things in us. One of my favorite sayings, and I won't get it exactly right, but is that for almost anything to be used for good, it first has to be broken. To build a house, a tree has to be broken. To have a crop, the soil has to be broken. To have a loaf of bread, grain has to be broken. And sometimes for God to use us, we have to be broken as well. And Paul here is understanding of the importance of this crisis in his life, that just because he was going through a crisis didn't mean that God was done with him, that God couldn't use him, that God wasn't still on the throne. And Paul was able to keep his confidence, to stay positive, to stay off. This is the book in the book of Philippians where Paul talks about peace that passeth all understanding. He wrote that from this Roman jailhouse, chained to guards 24/7. He wrote these words that says that what's happened to me is for the good of the gospel. And so my challenge to you tonight is, the choice is yours. The decision is each one of us. We can't typically do much about the crisis coming down the road. But what we can do something about is how we respond and what we make out of that crisis in our life. I pray you won't have a crisis. I pray that your life goes just smooth as silk, that you never have an issue, but unfortunately, you probably will. And so the challenge is not the external. The challenge is the internal and the eternal. And so let's pray together that we'll use crisis in our life to further the gospel, as Paul has said. All right, have a great day, great evening, great rest of the day, and we will see you back here next Wednesday night.